JameStation64.
Almost 8 months ago I did a video about Pilotwings64. I then promised Turok Dinosaur Hunter would be up next, and then most of 2021 went by. I actually did start playing and recording footage for the game straight after publishing the last video, but eventually Churrock just broke me. Despite getting right near the end of the game, a combination of Churrock fatigue and personal life stress made me put the game and the whole channel on the back burner for a while. One night recently, however, I was watching the amazing Cliff on Twitch. Make sure to check him out on his brilliant N64 Live podcast. And he gave this channel a plug despite it basically being dead, and I thought, bugger it, let's get this finished, and I finally managed it. Churrock is beaten, and now I can finally do the review that's been a monkey on my back for the past half year. So what is Churrock for the uninitiated? Well, Churrock was and still is a comic book series dating back to the 1950s. In 1994, Acclaim Entertainment decided to expand their influence by buying the publishers of the Churrock series, Valiant Comics, and use this not only keep publishing the comics, but create games based off of those series. As well as the Churrock series getting N64 games, so would others from the newly formed Acclaim Comics, such as Shadow Man and Armorines. Turok was the first to see the light of day though, with early plans to be a North American launch title for the Nintendo 64. It would end up missing the North American launch, but crept in a few days after the European launch of the N64 in March of 1997. Due to its early release back when the N64 release schedule was very sparse, Turok was a huge deal. As the N64's only early mature game, it lacked competition and sold extremely well despite a hefty £70 price tag. The game itself is a first-person shooter. Back at the time when most FPS games were built around a Doom-style format, we would see Turok really up the ante. With a full range of movement and all-axis, jumping and analog control, this gave the game a much greater array of movement compared to Doom and all its clones. After Turok's release, we would start to see new FPS games start to move away from the Doom formula in an attempt to keep up with the advances first made by Turok and then eventually GoldenEye. The purpose of the game is to travel throughout a world called the Lost Lands, a violent and seemingly primitive land stuck in the middle point of the universe where humans, dinosaurs and aliens all interact. You play as Tal Set, the legendary Turok of the era, and are tasked with protecting the Lost Lands and the rest of the universe as the evil campaigner tries to retrieve the ancient and powerful Chronoscepter weapon in an attempt to conquer everything. This journey takes around 8 different huge levels, 4 bosses and tons of devastating weapons. The arsenal at Churrock's hand was one of, if not the big selling point. Starting out with just a knife and bow, then shortly after a pistol, you would eventually work your way up to the devastating Chronoscepter, assuming you collected all the pieces scattered throughout the 8 levels, right before the final confrontation with the campaigner, as well as things like the brilliant quad rocket launcher and my favourite, the fusion cannon. Think carrying around a portable weaponised version of Sellafield and you get the idea. All the weapons have great animation and suitably devastating impact that is incredibly satisfying. Turok doesn't skimp on the blood and guts. When an enemy is killed, you'll see them writhe, squirm and even try to stop the blood flowing from their wounds created by your weaponry. The animation is incredible for 1997 standards, even beats a lot of big name releases from the next generation of consoles, quite frankly. The attention to detail from the animation is absolute top draw from Iguana, developers of Turok under the Acclaim umbrella. The levels, for the most part, have a jungle setting and have a primitive and tribal look to them. Settlements feel ancient, like you've just walked into the Aztec Empire, with some raptors walking around them, of course. There's a few exceptions to the jungle setting, however, with level 5's dark and dingy catacombs, level 7's fiery lost lands, and finally level 8's futuristic final confrontation. It's a brilliant contrast of aesthetics, primitive and alien, that really makes Turok stand out from the usual FPS fodder at the time. The bosses are also impressive, despite only having 4 of them. The level 3 boss, the Long Hunter, is a 3-part boss involving taking out 2 of his jeeps to begin with before taking on the Long Hunter himself. The jeeps are straightforward enough once you figure out their blind spot, while the Long Hunter is a bit of a tricky git, not unlike the final boss in terms of strategy and difficulty in fact. The Catacombs Mantis is a cracking battle, maybe the best in the game, as you really have to learn the attack pattern on the fly and time your attacks well. It's more strategic than the other fights, if not as spectacular as the final 2. The last 2 bosses face you pretty much back to back at the end of the final level, with Thunder, the campaigner's pet cyborg T-Rex, greeting you first, and probably being a stiffer challenge than the final boss himself. Mainly because he comes at you after a long slog from the last save point, and if you're not careful you might be running low on good weaponry and health when you finally reach him. The fight is mainly strafing and blasting, but an awesome spectacle nonetheless. The campaigner himself is a tricky bugger if you haven't got the Chrono Scepter, as that is the only weapon that takes significant health off him. Timing the 3 shots you have is essential to master if you plan on trying to beat him on higher difficulties. Otherwise he's basically a much quicker Long Hunter with way more health. The same strategy of just keep moving and blasting seems to work well enough. Beating the campaigner in the game is a hell of an achievement, as this is far from an easy game, even on easy. Its difficulty is sadly due to the game's shortcomings, however. The first big issue is how scarce save points are. You can be playing for over an hour in some sections before even finding a save point. This seems even worse in this day and age, given that most modern games allow you to save whenever the hell you want. Add in that enemies are placed in some very unfair positions, you really have to memorise the layout of the game to get through it. Then it just becomes trial and error, unfortunately. The problem is that some enemies are hidden around corners and will blast you before you even have the opportunity to hit them first. Even if you know exactly where they are, it's sometimes impossible to actually react in time to get the first hit in. It doesn't help how much damage some enemies take to die is random. Some enemies may take 1 or 2 hits, while other ones turn into a bullet sponge for seemingly no logical reason. Enemy respawning is also a nightmare. Again, it's trial and error learning which enemies are going to respawn, which ones aren't, and how many times the ones which do respawn will respawn, and where, as sometimes they will respawn directly behind you. Probably the 2 most famous issues, however, are the jumping and the fog. There's a reason why games like Doom and GoldenEye tend to avoid platforming elements. You see, pixel-perfect platform jumping over bottomless pits in first-person mode is absolutely infuriating. Turok, however, is littered with these insta-death sections, the most famous being the pillar maze right before the level 3 boss. These sections are horrible, and even though the game does control well, a first-person viewpoint makes these sections absolute nightmare fuel. And then there's the fog. Well, the fog isn't that bad, to be honest. It makes the game run well, and it looks pretty close up for a 1997 game, and it does add more of an intense atmosphere. That being said, it's probably too close, seemingly only being a few yards away from your nose at some point. And there's no justification for being shot by enemies shrouded in the fog that you cannot possibly see yet. That's just unfair. It's a shame that these niggles combine to pull this game down. When it's free flowing, it's incredibly fun. I'd argue it's more fun when you put in the cheats and don't have to worry about unfair enemy placement, enemies respawning right behind you or being blasted from beyond the fog. And unfortunately, outside of messing around with the extensive cheats list, there's not much to make you come back after you've played through the game. I enjoyed playing it for the most part though, and I'm very proud to finally beat the game, but I can't see me ever trying to beat it again, at least not the base version. I might check out the remastered version at some point when it comes down in price. The replay value would have been increased had there been multiplayer, but unfortunately split-screen deathmatches were not common on console FPS games at that time. We would have to wait until the sequel for multiplayer Churrock goodness, sadly. So this leaves me in a tricky position of whether to say it's a good game or not. It does so many things well, but then a seemingly equal amount of things poorly. The falls themselves, barring maybe the jumping sections, wouldn't be that bad on their own, but as a combination of problems they do build up. That being said, for a first generation third party N64 title, this is a hell of an achievement from Iguana, and something that the devs can be immensely proud of for its time. And despite those flaws, I still have a massive soft spot for it, so I'm going to give it a solid 3 out of 5. Fortunately, the game isn't particularly rare or pricey, and an unboxed copy shouldn't cost you over a tenner on eBay, and a box copy for less than £20. As such, it's a reasonably low risk purchase and costs less than the remastered version as well. In fact, only Turok 3 goes for anything close or above the original RRP from the N64 Churrock releases, with Seeds of Evil and Rage Wars also being dirt cheap. Overall then, I think it's well worth the gander if you want to see the evolution of console FPS. You'll get hours of fun and plenty of frustration too out of it, even if you're never going to come back to it after completion. And that is, finally, episode 4 of JameStation64 in the can. Next up it should be FIFA 64, assuming I don't decide to try and dissolve my head in a vat of sulfuric acid to avoid playing that ranted turd of a game. In the meantime, drop us a follow on Twitter at JameStation64, and until next time, laters.